He spent his life saving others, but missed the betrayal unfolding in his own home. His wife, his brother, even his son. For 20 years they lied to his face, until the day he uncovered everything and performed the most precise operation of his career on his own family. The golden rays of a fading afternoon filtered through the expansive windows of the Pierce residence, casting elongated shadows across the pristine kitchen. Logan Pierce, a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon known for his exacting standards and unshakable composure, stood watching as the catering team finalized the setup for his son Ethan's graduation celebration. His height and sharp silver gaze gave him a quiet authority that lingered in any room he entered, whether operating theater or boardroom. Without a word, he sipped his coffee, his attention never drifting from the details outside. The lead caterer stepped in, clipboard in hand, seeking direction on the seafood arrangement. Logan, never one to speak unnecessarily, gestured calmly toward the west side of the pool area, beneath the protective cover of the canopy. From the corner of his eye, through the arched kitchen doorway, he noticed Ruby Allen, his wife of over 2 decades, giving pointed instructions to the design crew. Her movements were calculated, every gesture too deliberate, too bright. At 52, Ruby still turned heads, with a disciplined physique shaped by years of tennis and a wardrobe curated by luxury boutiques. But Logan had long since learned to look past what was carefully maintained on the outside. She swept into the kitchen, her silk dress whispering across the tiles. Her voice carried a note of urgency, polished and practiced. "The living room needed final touches," she said. Logan turned slightly, but before he could respond, Don Harper entered from the terrace. His demeanor was relaxed, perhaps too relaxed, the kind that comes from years of cultivating charm rather than earning trust. With practiced ease, Don offered to handle the outdoor decorations, brushing a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Logan acknowledged the offer with a nod, though his grip on the coffee mug subtly tightened. For the past year, he'd taken to keeping his phone nearby at all times, not to scroll but to record. The suggestion had come from Ryan Wells, a former military operative now in private security. Ryan had been the first to point out certain patterns, financial discrepancies, altered schedules, unspoken routines between Ruby and Don that raised flags. Lila Moreno, one of the more competent nurses from Logan's practice, arrived shortly after with a folder of pending documents requiring weekend review. Logan invited her to spread them on the kitchen island. Ruby's smile stiffened as the papers rustled, her fingers tightening on the stem of her wine glass. Across the room, Don's expression faltered for a moment. There was a subtle shift, barely noticeable, unless, of course, one was trained to see it. Ethan burst into the kitchen, energy barely contained within his formal attire. He was Logan's son by name, and until recently Logan believed by nature as well. Ethan beckoned him toward the study, needing help with his med school application, specifically, his personal statement about hospital volunteer work. They moved into the study, the air cooler quieter. From there, Logan had a clear view of the backyard, where Don moved with an ownership that unsettled him. Surveillance cameras discreetly installed by Ryan months ago watched it all. Logan inquired gently about the hours Ethan had logged at the hospital, pressing ever so slightly when it came to the time spent specifically with his uncle Don. The boy shifted uneasily, evading the question just as a message from his girlfriend Clara lit up his screen. He excused himself, grateful for the distraction. Left alone, Logan returned to the kitchen, choosing his moment with surgical precision. The caterers had stepped outside. From his position by the window, he watched what unfolded near the ivy-covered trellis. Don reached for Ruby, and she leaned into him with the intimacy of history, not novelty. Their kiss, brief but unmistakable, spoke volumes, more than words ever could. Ruby laughed, a sound more triumphant than joyful, just loud enough to carry. The line between secrecy and arrogance had long since blurred. Logan didn't flinch. Decades in high-stakes surgery had taught him the value of restraint. He merely watched. What Ruby didn't see was the man behind the glass, or the fact that their voices carried. She joked to Don about Logan's obliviousness, about how easy it had been to maintain the charade. Don agreed with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. When they finally noticed Logan standing at the window, their reactions were telling. Not fear, but something worse. Smugness. Logan said nothing. His silence was louder than rage. Ethan appeared at his side again, hesitant, apologetic. He mumbled something about having made a choice long ago, about Don always being there, about homework, baseball games, emotional presence. Logan listened, eyes unreadable, then reached into his inner jacket pocket. A USB drive lay there, its weight far greater than its size suggested. It contained months of recordings, transactions, and surveillance, each file a scalpel to be used when the time was right. Ruby re-entered the kitchen, dragging Don with her. There was sarcasm in her tone, mockery in her posture. Logan responded with controlled precision, challenging the facade they had built piece by piece. Don's protests were hollow, his confidence beginning to splinter. The conversation escalated, but Logan remained grounded, unveiling his evidence layer by layer until the room fell silent, held captive by truth. That night, Logan left the party before dessert was served. As he stepped outside, phone still recording, he knew one thing with clarity. This was only the beginning. The incisions had been made. Now came the operation. Logan Pierce sat alone in his study, the flicker of firelight playing across the polished wood of his desk. Outside, the remnants of Ethan's graduation party lingered in silence, the faint echoes of laughter fading into the night. In his hand, he rotated the small USB drive Ryan Wells had helped compile, each rotation grounding him for what came next. By dawn, Ruby Allen found herself standing in the same kitchen where her world had begun to unravel. Logan appeared calm, measured. He slid a single envelope across the countertop. Divorce documents. Clean, undeniable start to the end. Alongside the envelope, he placed the USB drive. Ruby's hands trembled as she picked it up, her skin pale against the stainless steel. She dismissed it as baseless, fabricated paranoia. But Logan remained unmoved. The drive held more than just accusations. It contained recorded phone calls between Ruby and Don Harper, details of foreign wire transfers, and location data from family vacations that aligned a little too perfectly with unexplained withdrawals. The evidence was surgical, collected with meticulous care and precision. She had 1 hour to pack. The locks would be changed by 9 a.m. Ruby's voice rose, the practiced elegance giving way to panic. She called it her home, her family, her life. Logan corrected her. What they once shared had been hollowed out by choices she'd made long ago. Morrison, his legal representative, arrived shortly after with a restraining order prohibiting contact and freezing shared accounts. The message was clear. The masquerade had ended. Simultaneously, Ryan delivered similar documents to Don Harper across town. The man who once moved through Logan's home with smug familiarity now stood in disbelief on his own front steps, clutching legal documents that laid bare his betrayal. Every email, transaction, and secret meeting had been documented. By midday, Logan was already in strategy meetings. His legal team and Ryan had drawn up a plan months ago. Now it was just execution. The hospital board was next. Not just for personal revenge, but to protect the institution he had dedicated his life to. Don's role as hospital administrator had placed him in a position of financial oversight and abuse. Days later, in a cold, glass-walled conference room, Ruby and Don met with a man named Ian McKinn, a corporate fixer with a reputation for aggressive damage control. Don paced, muttering about the recordings, the account numbers, the offshore logs. Ruby attempted to keep her composure, but the cracks showed. They both knew Logan didn't move unless he was certain of the outcome. McKinn suggested a counterattack, one aimed at Logan's character. Paint him as unstable, obsessed, a man incapable of accepting his family's independence. They would initiate a campaign within the hospital board to question his mental fitness to practice. Don, who had spent years building alliances within the administration, was to be the face of this narrative. The emergency board meeting was scheduled within the week. Don stood before the members, voice trembling just enough to convey concern. He spoke of Logan's controlling nature, of his sudden interest in surveillance and isolation. Stellan Voss, the chairman and longtime supporter of Don's policies, nodded solemnly. There were murmurs of a possible suspension or mandatory leave. Logan walked into the room just as Don made his final point. With him was Ryan, who carried a laptop. Logan's timing, as always, was precise. Without raising his voice, he requested the board's attention. He gestured for Ryan to connect the laptop to the main screen. Numbers filled the projection, charts, ledgers, digital footprints. Then came the audio. Don's voice authorizing budget misallocations, directing staff to reroute foundation money under obscure labels, and implicating board members in quiet agreements. The boardroom shifted. Faces paled. Stellan Voss's name appeared in several recordings. Don's defense faltered, his composure cracking. Logan stood silently as the evidence did what years of suspicion could not. It exposed everything. In the days that followed, the hospital initiated a full financial audit. Don was placed on administrative leave. Ruby's name was pulled from every charity board she had once led. Their reputations didn't simply fall, they imploded. Ethan, who had grown quiet since the party, was called in for questioning. The investigation had revealed his presence during several financial transactions he had assisted under the guise of learning administration. What began as errands turned into complicity. During a tense legal session, Logan sat across from his son. Ethan attempted to explain how Ruby and Don had convinced him Logan wouldn't understand, that he was dangerous if crossed. Logan listened without expression. The son he had raised bore too many resemblances to the man who had betrayed him. The subtle gestures, the tone of voice, echoes of Don Harper where there should have been traces of Logan Pierce. Ethan's involvement was undeniable. Frozen accounts, a revoked college fund, a future that now hung in limbo. But Logan didn't waver. The surgical removal of deceit required clear hands and a steady grip. He had learned long ago that even the deepest cuts were necessary when removing disease. In his office, surrounded by files and legal motions, Logan reflected not with regret but resolve. The truth had always been there, beneath layers of charm and illusion. Now it was exposed. The operation had begun. The rot was visible. And with each step forward, the cleansing continued. The weeks following the boardroom reckoning unfolded with the precision of an orchestrated procedure. Logan Pierce, long revered for his composure under pressure, now directed that same surgical focus toward a different battlefield, one where betrayal, manipulation, and deceit were the conditions to be removed. Each motion filed, each document presented, followed a plan that had been set into motion well before the first confrontation. Don Harper, once so confident in his web of influence, watched his control slip away. His medical license had not yet been revoked, but the review process was underway, and the outcome looked increasingly grim. He had siphoned funds from cancer research, masked as equipment upgrades and administrative expenses. Every discrepancy had been documented. Logan ensured the governing board received the complete audit before Don could spin another narrative. Ruby Allen fared no better. Her charm, once her weapon, had lost its power. Social invitations dried up. Longtime friends ignored her messages. The same women she once led on fundraising committees now whispered about misappropriated charity money and fabricated expenses. What had begun as a slow decline quickly turned into collapse. At the core of the chaos stood Ethan Pierce, the young man Logan had believed to be his son. During a tense mediation, Logan produced two documents, one confirming biological parentage, and another filled with transcriptions of conversations between Ethan, Ruby, and Don. The implications were clear. Ethan had known more than he ever admitted. He had participated. The room had fallen into silence as Logan spoke not with anger, but with clarity. Ethan was not his son by blood, and perhaps never had been by loyalty. His presence at the hospital had served more than academic curiosity. It had facilitated access to confidential files, administrative passwords, and even restricted accounts. Ethan, no longer the self-assured graduate from weeks ago, now sat in mediation sessions with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. He mumbled apologies, but they rang hollow. Logan didn't seek remorse. He demanded accountability. Years of micro-betrayals had compounded into systemic involvement in financial fraud. Ruby's defenses grew more frantic. She accused Logan of turning the family against her, of choosing his career over them. Logan countered with timelines, of surgeries performed while she drained their personal savings, of business trips used as fronts for clandestine meetings. She referenced family and sacrifice. He responded with bank records and surveillance logs. Don tried appealing to fraternity. They were brothers once, he reminded Logan. But that bond had dissolved the moment trust was broken. Logan's response was firm and final. Biology was not absolution. The patients affected by delayed treatments would not be comforted by excuses, and neither would he. In private consultations, Logan's legal team began outlining final motions for divorce and asset division. Ruby attempted to claim equity in Logan's private practice. She cited contributions to the household and to his image. But Logan's counter-evidence, screenshots, financial statements, voice recordings, proved otherwise. Every asset Ruby attempted to claim had ties to accounts she'd helped undermine. Don's attempt to retain his hospital position collapsed under the weight of forensic reports. The audit showed altered expense lines, falsified vendor invoices, and misdirected research funds. With each layer peeled back, his narrative crumbled further. His pleas for reconsideration were ignored. The medical board issued an indefinite suspension pending further review. During a final, closed-door session at the hospital, Don made one last desperate attempt. He cited shared goals, lifelong service, and misunderstandings. Logan, ever composed, presented a document detailing how Don's decisions delayed critical research trials by months. The list of patients affected had names and faces. It wasn't theoretical. It was personal. One name stood out, a teenage girl whose clinical trial had been postponed due to budget reallocations. She had passed away before the trial resumed. Her parents had unknowingly contributed to the hospital foundation, believing it would save their daughter. Logan's voice remained steady as he presented this story to the board, but his hands trembled once out of view. By the time Don left the hospital that afternoon, he no longer had clearance. His badge had been deactivated. Ruby, meanwhile, was left battling a crumbling legal defense and dwindling financial support. Her attempts to salvage her image in the community failed spectacularly. She was no longer the poised hostess of fundraising galas. She was a pariah. As legal proceedings accelerated, Logan finalized the establishment of a new charitable foundation, this one named after the girl whose treatment was delayed. The foundation would be built not on vanity or image, but on transparency and accountability. Ethan, now estranged from both Ruby and Don, reached out one last time. He requested a meeting not to beg, but to ask for help. He cited tuition shortfalls, mounting debt, and uncertainty about the future. Logan listened quietly, then handed over a list. It contained the names of patients affected by Don and Ruby's misdeeds, along with dates and outcomes. He instructed Ethan to read each name, to absorb each consequence. There would be no rescue, no last-minute reprieve. Not this time. Ethan had been given chances, each one squandered. The lesson was over. Logan had no space left for maybes or mistakes. He had severed the infected tissue. The healing would begin, but not for those who brought the infection. 3 years passed like a well-rehearsed medical procedure, measured, precise, and entirely predictable. Logan Pierce stood at the massive glass windows of his penthouse, the city skyline reflecting in his eyes. The chaos that had once defined his personal life had been reduced to a distant echo, no more than a scar from a long-healed incision. His reflection showed the toll and the triumph. Silver streaked his hair, and fine lines mapped his experience, but his posture remained commanding. The quarterly financial reports from his private surgical practice, displayed on the screen behind him, told the rest of the story. The numbers were more than healthy, they were enviable. Even the most seasoned hospital administrators would have found them hard to match. Don Harper, now far removed from that world, certainly would. Don had not recovered. After the scandal, his medical license was restricted to minor procedures under supervision. He relocated to a small rural clinic in the Midwest, where his past followed him in whispers. His colleagues avoided him, and the patients knew only part of the story, enough to keep their distance. He no longer introduced himself with confidence. Even his name had changed. The Clark legacy had become a liability, one he couldn't afford to carry. Ruby Allen's fall was equally unforgiving. Her once curated lifestyle dissolved. Designer clothes gave way to off-the-rack discounts, and perfectly manicured nails were replaced with chipped polish. She worked at the front desk of a dental office, where most clients barely looked twice. The same community that once embraced her now excluded her from luncheons, galas, and school events. The story of her betrayal had traveled farther than she ever imagined. Ethan Pierce, once poised to attend an elite medical program, now worked double shifts as a pharmacy technician. After years of failed attempts to reconcile with Logan, he had settled into quiet frustration. His college fund had remained frozen, and his record, though never formally charged, was marred enough to keep him out of reputable programs. A congratulatory email he once sent to Logan had bounced back with an automated legal response. Clay security firm, now handling the entire Pierce Foundation's protection, enforced a strict no-contact policy. Any outreach attempts from Dawn, Ruby, or Ethan were logged and countered with legal action. The lines had been drawn clearly and permanently. Meanwhile, Logan's world had grown stronger, cleaner. His relationship with Talia Noor, a trauma surgeon with the same unshakable ethics and fire for her work, had blossomed naturally. They shared late nights, not in conflict but in consultation, discussing patients, policies, and the future they were building together. The charitable foundation Logan had launched in the aftermath of the scandal expanded rapidly. It now funded pediatric cancer research, supported scholarships for medical students from underserved communities, and operated free clinics across the state. One of the clinics bore the name of a young girl whose delayed treatment had galvanized the entire mission. Her parents had since become outspoken advocates for the foundation, appearing at its annual galas. Logan's reputation, once threatened by baseless attacks, now stood taller than ever. He was named in a national medical journal for his humanitarian contributions. The article included a photo of him and Talia receiving an award at a benefit dinner. Her visible pregnancy in the image only deepened the sense of renewal that defined his present life. Across the country, in a faded apartment above a pawn shop, Don sat watching that very article on an old laptop. His hand trembled as he poured another drink. Ruby, sitting nearby in worn slippers, muttered about hypocrisy and bad luck, but even her bitterness had dulled. Their son rarely visited. Their friends were gone. The Clark name had become a shadow. They had once tried to seize a piece of Logan's new success. Through an aggressive lawyer, they made a claim to the intellectual property rights of a surgical technique Logan had developed. The attempt collapsed immediately. Clay's firm had records of Don's previous unauthorized access to Logan's research files. The countersuit was so airtight their own attorney dropped them as clients. Back in the city, Logan didn't even need to read the full report. His assistant forwarded only the summary. Their latest attempt had failed like the ones before it. Talia had suggested they spend the weekend away, just the two of them before the baby arrived. He agreed without hesitation. That evening, they dined on the terrace of their penthouse, overlooking the illuminated skyline. Talia spoke of clinic expansions and new trial partnerships. Logan listened, calm and content. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to defend. It felt like something to shape. When Talia mentioned that Ethan had approached her at the trauma center, Logan merely nodded. The boy had asked her to intervene, to help him reconnect. She had told him that integrity wasn't up for negotiation. It was a line neither she nor Logan would ever cross. The past, like scar tissue, would remain, but it would no longer ache. Logan had rebuilt everything they had tried to destroy, and he had done so not with vengeance, but with vision. 5 years had passed since Logan Pierce dismantled the web of betrayal that had nearly consumed his life. The aftermath still lingered, not as chaos, but as quiet echoes that whispered caution with every step forward. He had not only rebuilt what was lost, He had constructed something far greater from the wreckage. His penthouse office, now part of a gleaming medical tower overlooking the city, buzzed with purpose. One wing housed his private surgical practice. Another belonged to the foundation he had founded in the wake of his family's collapse. A framed photograph sat on his desk. A smiling group of scholarship recipients, children of cancer patients, the very mission that had driven him when everything else had fallen apart. Outside, the urban skyline glowed in the twilight, but Logan's attention was on a legal folder just delivered by Clay's security liaison. It documented the final restraining order extension filed against Don Harper, Ruby Allen, and Ethan Pierce. Though they rarely attempted contact anymore, the protections remained in place. Logan had no desire to reopen wounds that had finally scarred over. In a small Nebraska town, far from the city lights, Don now worked in a local clinic. The building was aging, its paint peeling, its equipment barely up to date. Patients came with common colds and sprains, nothing like the high-stakes environment he once ruled. He no longer introduced himself as Dr. Harper. The name had become a liability. His once commanding presence had deteriorated. Colleagues treated him with polite distance. He had changed his surname to Andrews, hoping to bury the past, but whispers always found their way back. Ruby had fared no better. Age had settled hard across her once glamorous features. Her wardrobe, once curated with designer labels, was now sourced from discount outlets. She answered phones at a dental office, where few recognized her or cared to ask who she had once been. Her attempts to join local women's groups ended in rejection. Her betrayal was still spoken about in hushed tones at community events. Their modest apartment held relics of a life they once lived, newspaper clippings of Logan's success, screenshots of Foundation press releases, photos of Logan and Talia nor attending charity galas or medical symposiums. Ruby obsessed over each one, convinced there was still a path back. Don, though, had long abandoned hope. He poured drinks in silence, avoiding her gaze. Their son, Ethan, had moved out years earlier. He lived alone in a small apartment near a pharmacy where he worked nights. His dreams of medicine had died long before. Each application he submitted was quietly declined. Background checks exposed his involvement in a fraud case too public to ignore. Every romantic relationship ended when the truth resurfaced. He had tried once to reach out to Logan. His email was returned unread. Spencer had since changed his name legally to avoid association, but the digital record remained. Even his online presence carried the stains of past actions. Employers hesitated. Universities closed doors. The cost of choosing the wrong side had followed him like a shadow he could never outrun. Back in the city, Logan sat in the neonatal wing of a hospital named after his daughter. Grace Integrity Pierce had been born earlier that spring. The announcement in a prominent medical journal had included a note about the opening of a new pediatric oncology unit in her honor, funded in part by the recovered assets from Don's fraud. Talia had read the letter from Don's mother aloud the day it arrived. The late matriarch had amended her will before passing, leaving her estate not to her disgraced son, but to Logan's foundation. The letter was public, its language sharp and final, an expression of deep shame for Don's actions and a hope that Logan would continue to bring healing where her son had brought harm. One evening, Logan returned to his penthouse after a long day of surgeries and meetings. Talia greeted him with their daughter in her arms, her eyes alight with the contentment of a life earned, not given. They had built something strong, free from manipulation, anchored in mutual respect and unwavering principle. He read the latest security report Clay's team had filed, but barely skimmed the contents. Another failed attempt by Don and Ruby to claim residuals from a former patent. Another rejection. Another reminder that their reach had finally, completely ended. That night, over dinner, Talia spoke of expansion. More scholarships, another free clinic in a neighboring state. Logan listened with quiet pride. He didn't speak of the past unless necessary. It had lost its grip. His present was filled with life, purpose, and family, one chosen by conviction, not birthright. From afar, Don and Ruby watched this unfold like outsiders to a world they once tried to control. The photos of gala nights, medical achievements, and joyful milestones played like a silent film they were no longer cast in. Their punishment wasn't legal or financial, it was existential. They had to live each day knowing what they had destroyed, and that the man they had tried to dismantle had used their betrayal to build something far more enduring. Some scars never fade. But for Logan Pierce, they no longer defined him. They served as markers where he had been, what he had overcome, and who he had chosen to become.